everyone. Thank you so much for joining our literary reading series, Literary Nights with Unsolicited Press. Tonight, we have some exciting authors who are here to talk about their books. And they include fiction, creative nonfiction, and poetry. Everyone is going to be reading in alphabetical order. And afterwards, if we have time, we'll do a Q&A. I am Rosalia Scalia, the host of Literary Nights with Unsolicited Press. Thank you all for coming and welcome. And we're going to start with Mr. Costa this evening. Mr. Costa, Joseph Costa is an adjunct professor of English at Tampa, but also a freelance writer, and his fiction has appeared in a myriad of places. So let's welcome Mr. Costa.
Hello, everybody. So this is my book, Comets. I'll show you the cover. It's out. And it's also, as all Unsolicited Press, it's a digital book as well on Kindle. And this is also on iTunes as an audio book. So I'm very fortunate to have it in three different places. And Comets is based on experiences that I had growing up. My dad had a cabinet shop for 60 years in the Latin Quarter of Tampa called Ybor City. And there were a lot of immigrants in and out of the shop. And this sort of chronicles someone like me, but not exactly me. So it is fictionalized. The story I'm going to read part of it, about 10 minutes, and is called Involuntary Memory. And it's based on something that happened, and it takes place much later this is a collection of short fiction, but there's a through line protagonist that runs through all the stories, and this takes place much later in his life. Involuntary Memory. The floor creaked in the hall outside my bedroom at 3:20 in the morning, and shortly after that, the doorknob quietly turned. I had a Louisville Slugger in my hands and a 100-pound dog snoring next to my bed. On the other side of the door was Mike Harper, a childhood friend who had suffered a mental breakdown, thought mobsters were after him, was carrying a large knife and pining away for Adeline, a woman he hadn't seen in a dozen years. I sat up 3 feet from the door, doing my best Pete Rose, ready to bash his face in. The bat slid wet in my palm, sweat tickled my back. The doorknob creaked. I set my stance and saw my moonlit shadow winding up against the wall for a home run swing. Running through my mind, I wondered what it would sound like. I wondered where the blood would go. Mike had been a good friend, but if he came through that door, there was a good chance I'd kill him. I'd arrived home from my shop earlier and brewed coffee, and I watched a bright shaft of sunlight in my living room get wintered away by a fat great cloud. It was late in the afternoon, and the sky dimmed in anticipation of a front. As soon as I moved toward the window, Dash, my yellow lab, was on his feet, nuzzling me with the kind of loyalty unique to dogs. I scratched his head, and I opened the blinds fully, filling the room with a bluish light. Across the street, jack-o'-lanterns with the carved faces of comedy and tragedy stared at me from my neighbor's porch. I sipped coffee, and I watched the stray calico bury shit in my cypress mulch. The phone rang. It was Mike calling to dredge up the past. 45 minutes later, I pulled into Union Station, and I looked for that familiar face among the scattered groups of people bound under umbrellas. Through the wipers and the raindrops, I saw a man who resembled Mike, but this guy had a distended stomach, a bloated face, and receding wavy hair. He wore what looked to be an expensive suit, white shirt and no tie, and he floated through the parking lot, his head high and his nose up. Mike, I said, assessing what the years had done. It's been a long time, and I shook his hands, which were soft and slender. There were people in the train station watching me. His eyes darted nervously. Two old guys in suits. People have agendas, he said. We'd better get out of here. He smiled awkwardly, revealing yellow teeth, and I smelled alcohol on his breath, and I noticed that his eyes were glassy and red. I opened the rear hatch, and he tossed in his beat-up leather bag. He clambered into the passenger seat. What did you do, crawl here? I said, 45 minutes, Mike. I lost my cell phone, he said, and then he turned quickly to look out the passenger window, and then through the side view mirror as I pulled away. Mike smelled unwashed and had a few days of beard growth, and he looked around the interior of my new Jeep, and he said, when I lived in Europe, I drove a Mercedes SUV. You wouldn't believe how tight that motherfucker was. German tolerance precision is measured in micrometers. I was surprised to get your call, I said, and I turned up the air a notch. I thought you'd fallen off the earth. Mike nodded as if there were more to say, but he said nothing. He didn't run a car because his mother wasn't driving anymore and he needed to pick up her Buick. Adeline and I split up, he blurted out. She took everything from me. She took my soul. Sins and secrets reside in shallow graves, and at that moment I regretted having picked up the phone, and I regretted Mike's presence here. Have you spoken to her? I said. Mike tugged at his bottom lip, a tick he always had, and he shook his head. Things have changed, he said, and he stared through the passenger window at the endless line of strip malls and restaurants, and he appeared perplexed by it all, like an alien studying a landscape of concrete and fluorescent lights that blurred into hues of color in the wetness and fading light. We drove to the cadence of windshield wipers and the rain, and there was an uncomfortable silence that filled the space between us. How long has it been since you've been home? I said. He shook his head and he said, I need a drink, man. We went back to my house and I turned on all the lights so Mike could see the place. I pulled 2 beers out of the fridge, and Mike asked if I had something stronger, with Dash thumping his rebar tail against the wall and jumping all over him. There's a bottle of vodka in the cabinet next to the fridge, I said. I told Dash to lie in his bed, and he did, but he kept a cautious eye on Mike. Vodka from Texas, Mike scoffed, and he poured a hefty glass with some ice, and he tapped it to my beer. Did you buy the house like this? He looked around, and it made me feel good. No, I spent a year renovating, did every bit of it myself. I refinished the wood floors, plastered the walls, built new cabinets as they were built in the 1920s. It's listed on the National Historic Registry. He looked around and he nodded and plotted himself on the couch and immediately lowered the blinds. Rain fell hard and tapped on my windows like 1,000 strangers. I choked up on the bat, and I thought about pitching those round summer melons in high school, swinging for the cheap seats and laughing like hell with my friends. The melons exploded, sending red flesh all directions. I stared at the bedroom door. It was an original from the 1920s, sturdy door with a crystal doorknob that sparkled in the moonlight, and the door creaked behind Mike's weight, and sweat dripped into one of my eyes and burned. My breathing got shallow, and the room closed in. What part had I played in the events that led to this moment? Did he know about me and what I had done, or was I paranoid? I knew the kind of monster he was and what had occurred so many years ago, and I wanted to hurt him for it. I thought about Mike and the day our friendship ended, and I stepped into my resolve, waiting for his face to show through that door. One summer, before Adeline, Mike and I went out with 2 girls. The girls and Mike were in their mid-20s, and I was in college. One of the girls brought out 4 glasses of sweet tea, and we sat by their apartment pool under the shade of an umbrella, and for that afternoon, we were rich. It was a hot day, and the tea was cold, and the girls were curvy and sexy in their bikinis, and they were smoking menthol cigarettes. Mike and the girls were laughing about a joke that I wasn't in on. And then he looked at me and said, listen, don't freak out, but we put something in the tea, LSD. And I knew he was serious, and I was pissed, and my stomach knotted. I didn't want that shit in my body. They were all talking at once and saying how much fun we were going to have. And one of the girls flashed me, and the 3 of them laughed even harder. And I started to calm down, and the world began to warp. Things all seemed to move differently, slower. The familiar became peculiar. Then Mike said it was going to last 6 to 7 hours, and there was nothing I could do about it, and I just needed to stay cool and have fun and ride it out. 6 to 7 hours of hallucinating, laughing, crying, huddled in the corner, scared, wondering when it was going to end. And I avoided Mike's calls for more than a year after that. And then he called and offered a half-assed apology for what had happened. And he asked me to meet him and his fiancée at a wine bar. I rattled up in my Falcon with a $95 Earl Scheib paint job, and I parked next to Mike's new BMW. Mike wore a coat and a tie, and he flashed money, and he introduced me to Adeline. And she was an emergency room nurse, an RN with a crazy, unapologetic laugh. When she spoke, she placed her hand on my arm in a way that made me feel as if I'd known her for years. Her brown hair was pulled back into a functional ponytail, and she had a round, freckled face with soft caramel eyes. There was a sizable marquee diamond on her finger and a silver band. And Mike doted on her, and I couldn't blame him. I liked her instantly, and I think the feeling was mutual. I watched them together, and I looked at his car and his suit and his trajectory, and I wanted what he had. I was there for his benefit, so I could see him in all his glory. And that was the last time I saw Mike until he showed up at the train station. We'd grown up looking over the fence, wanting, and suddenly he was on the other side looking back. Fear of the unknown is debilitating. Did Mike have a knife behind that door? Was he here to make me pay for what I'd done? I glanced at the clock. It was 3:21. Dash nudged my leg and growled. I quietly shushed him, thinking that we'd have the element of surprise. I squeezed the bat and rubbed on the knuckle I'd broken the night that Mike and the girls had drugged me, with no recollection of how it occurred except for having been told that I'd punched a hole through a wall in an imaginary fight. And it occurred to me that I had not forgiven him for that night or for his success. Anyway, the night doesn't get any better from there in this book. but this is a recollection much
That
later.
sounds really interesting.
And it basically follows the life of the protagonist from the time he's 8 years old. And these are all the characters that have been introduced in the book, and they're all sort of coming back. And it refers somewhat to the title Comets, which is reflective of or symbolic of the cyclical things and the mistakes we make in life. Everything comes back over and over and over again. But thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. After everyone reads, we'll have a short Q&A. Next up is Mr. Anthony DePietro, and he is a poet and a gay sex poet and an arts administrator, originally from Providence, Rhode Island. Now he's a deputy director of the Rose Arts Museum at Brandeis University, and we are looking forward to hearing what he's going to be reading this evening.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to Unsolicited Press for publishing the book and for inviting us here and creating this community and space to share the work. My book is called Kiss and Release. It's out February 13th. It's in pre-orders now if you want to go to the Unsolicited website. It's kind of a romantic and sexy, hopefully, poetry book. And so I'm going to read and share a handful of poems from the book. Who do you think you are? Did you ever try on your mother's high heels? Did you prefer red? Did you like the smell of nail polish remover? Could you make eye contact on the school bus? When you looked at older boys, did you notice their body hair patterns? Can you still recall your mother's friend's nephew stretching on a diving board? Didn't you notice Cousin Paul was, in Graham's words, a little artistic? Which parent went to bed first every night? Which would wake to stoke the fire in winter and crack open watermelon in summer? Why did you hate the day of the week that smelled like cinnamon buns? Do you remember the first time you unzipped a man's jeans? Whose couch were you on? When you moved to California, how did you choose which city? When you came back, why did you leave again? Are you the kind of person who stays friends with your exes? After 3 years with your partner, why did you kiss someone else at a party? What did you eat while your lover was too enraged to look at you? Why did you try to buy a dog and live in a suburb? Were you or were you not a workaholic like your father? Where was the first wedding when you felt old? Who visited you in your next apartment? Did you wear a condom every time? Were you already used to the quiet? How did you keep your spider plant alive? Which was fuller, your refrigerator or your freezer? How many times do you intend to move? Did you really think that was love? This next poem is called The Night I Asked You to Break My Heart. Because the split we'd made was good for us both, but this was 2 years later, hope's long coma, which could only end if the stronger of us pulled the cord from the power source. So I packed my messenger bag with methods to rend my most important organ. Steak knife, hammer, shards of broken glass, a broken mirror, straitjacket, guillotine in miniature, and in case we needed something more powerful, a magic book of curses. Most spells are made with words and broken by a kiss. Why not the other way around? I'll spare everybody the bloody fine points of how we got it done, and how I got home I can't remember, but I lay a long time unable to sleep, counting, instead of sheep, ex-loves who no longer take my calls. And in the event that they would take my calls, I divided them, like prison bricks, into 2 piles. Wouldn't know what to say and wouldn't know how to say it. As usual, this left me spent, and in sleep I dreamed 7 dreams. I dreamed a helicopter in a hurricane. It lifts, but it'll never get anywhere. I dreamed the waiter saw I was thirsty but would not bring water. I dreamed my brother cut himself open with a scythe in my grandfather's garden. I dreamed I came to your birthday at the Alabama governor's yellow mansion, and no one turned to speak to me except your twin. I dreamed myself heaving up chunks of pink cupcake. I dreamed the world ended, your way, with a single glowing solar flare, instead of my way. And I dreamed my dead wrestled your dead. I say again, my ghosts took up swords against your ghosts. And neither army had won when I twisted awake next morning, but at least the strange man in my mirror wasn't as ugly as I remembered. As I said, there's a lot of poems about romance in here. So one more of those. This is called, there's also several fuckboy poems in the book, and this is one of them. This is called Unrequited Fuckboy. The way I love you is only possible because I know next to nothing about you, boy from the neighborhood. I know your eyes that look as if you wear permanent eyeliner. I love the lashes that protect them and could swat a fly from across the sunroom. I know your rules, like condoms, no exceptions. While we make love, I insist you look deep in my eyes, and if you force me to insist one more time, I may playfully slap your cheek while I whisper. What is more intimate than a whisper? What is the real reason you can't love me back? Is it your white-collar family with their sailboats in the bay and summers on the island? Is it because I prefer the taste of artificial coconut to your unsweet, earth-safe, organic water? Mumbler, your mouth barely opens whenever you speak. Will you never make clear declarations? Will all conversations be bedroom conversations after I render you too tired to leave? But you do leave whenever I suggest you stay. Will you never stay from first whiskey until next day? Will I never write an aubade, a poem for lovers who part at dawn? The only poem I know how to write is the aubade's opposite, a fragment of 2 queers cruising after midnight. I think I can fit a couple of more. And I also like poems that travel. So I have a lot of travel in my book. A lot of poems are kind of in motion. This is called We Never Spoke of Dodge City Again. If we woke some nights tangled in blankets in a white and black room, I knew it meant we'd fallen asleep again before a movie ended. Mornings, I'd roll over and look at the mirror rather than at him. I did not know the hazel eyes would fade faster than someone's scent from a shirt sleeve or pillowcase. There were exactly 5 theories of love at the time, according to my notebook. No tests for those theories. You just had to know. Months later, we drove from one coast to another and not the same city. Passenger and driver, whatever else we were. By the time we reached Kansas, we were its ghost. A wisp of smoke lit by the red glare of taillights. Nearly invisible dust hovering over a mound of dirt. What little skin we had dried up in wind in small towns with white water towers, where orphaned branches blew along the ground outside of squat brick houses. Somewhere before Junction City, he paused to show me the millions of stars. I had never looked at them before, never strained my body looking, stretched all my senses, as if to trap galaxies tightly inside me. I knew their light would die before we arrived. The sudden lack of atmosphere astounded me, and he flew from my limbs so thin and airy that I barely noticed. There was one bridge in Kansas. We crossed it. I do have one more. Do I have time, Rosalia? 1 minute poem.
I think for a short one we do.
Yeah, this is like 1 minute. This is called When I Fall in Love, I Don't Say I'm in love. I say I'm in trouble. The way I love is any Joni Mitchell song, a wild silk beauty, dark and unexplainable, a jazz in 7 registers, vulnerable. The body's most sensitive place is tip of tongue. I'm in love, I say. I'm in trouble when his mood and moon wane, inevitable. After feeling, men get alone and want nothing. Their wild, slick beauty, dark and unattainable. The way they love is opposite double, wave particle theory. I always get it wrong in love. I say I'm in trouble, hearing the omen drumbeat. I tremble before the coming movement, crescendo, clang, a weird trick, beauty dark and inescapable. Before I bled with love, words were mere symbols of the real, a gray thing, biteless, with no sting. I'm in love, I say, I'm in trouble. A world-sick body, dumb and inconsolable. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to read.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Lara Lillibridge. And Lara has written multiple books, including Mama, Mama, Only Mama, Girlish, Growing Up in a Lesbian Home, an anthology, Feminine Rising, Voices, Power, and Invisibility, and the current one that's coming out with Unsolicited Press. Welcome, Lara, again, since you're a return guest.
Thank you. So my essay collection is called The Truth About Unringing Phones, and it comes out March 5th, so in just under 2 months. And it's filled with fragmented essays, and I'm just going to read one today that's called The Blue Hour. In winter, the Anchorage sun shines through the deep snow on the mountains, and the city is colored blue. Lapis shadows, azure snow, everything is drenched in tones of the night sky or the deepest ocean until the sun rises high enough for the light to reach us unfiltered, ordinary once more. That isn't actually the true scientific explanation for the bluing, but it was the one my father gave me as an invitation into the magic of Alaskan winter. Revising memory to conform with facts erodes that feeling of wonder. Let it be snow and sun and latitude. Let me hold the memory of the glint of my father's ice blue eyes and his smile crinkled face as he showed me the otherworldliness peculiar to his hometown. That first hour feels like a blending of story and reality, a hint of places where magic could live. And as I watched, moose, taller than a person, walked slowly down the silent street. The snow was so cold it squeaked beneath the twist of my boot heel. There was no wind in the valley, never wind in the valley, and the snow fell soft and dreamlike, unbuffeted, coming to rest on my aquanet shellacked hair like glitter. Don't touch it, my father said. Just let it dry and your hair will be fine. And it was. But I was not fine in the land of forget-me-nots and fireweed, of never being warm enough and a sun that never set in the summer and only rose for a few hours in the winter. When I had detention, I went to school in the dark and returned home in the dark, the blue hour, just a memory of when Anchorage was my vacation town, not my home. Instead, I looked out the window at snow-covered roads topped with a layer of sand because it was too cold for salt to be effective. The sun was always more white than yellow, colder and less friendly than the one back home in New York. And yes, I saw the northern lights, and more than once, and I didn't know that once I left Alaska, I'd be unable to see them the same way again. The lower latitude robbed the bands of their color. When I tried to explain how they really looked, the words didn't sound real even to my own ears. I mean to say that I didn't know to cherish them. Alaska was magic and untamed wildness, but also drugs and shoplifting and failing out of school. Anchorage's Spenard Road loomed like an alternate ending of my story, a place where in the 1980s, Native girls disappeared, only to be found dead with marks of torture on their young bodies. Girls I resembled with my long dark hair, though I wasn't Native. Alaska's winter was the place where I couldn't raise myself out of the shadows to be my better self, but I meant to. And one day I swore I'd come back after college and make myself and Alaska everything we were both capable of being. If only we had a bit more luck, and if only the blue hour lasted just a little bit longer. And of course, I never went back, despite my promise to the city. It was too far, too cold. It was, in the end, not my home, though it cradled me 9 months. At the end, I left it behind to live in the real world, meaning the lower 48. The only other place that called to me in the same way as Alaska was Key West, the diagonal opposite of the country. And though I loved that place too, it was always as its stepchild, a slight distance between me and the people born there, notwithstanding the history I was building. I was born in the middle of the country, and that's where I fit, where life will always feel real to me, even though it has no magic and no hour of blue, but only overcast skies. The edges were someplace I tried and I longed to keep, but somehow the cost was always too high. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Next up, we're going to hear from Lisa Mottolo. Lisa is a poet and an essayist, and she is the assistant editor at Atmosphere Press, and she's going to be reading from her forthcoming book. Welcome, Lisa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for popping in for this reading, and thanks to Unsolicited Press for putting this reading together. I'm going to be reading from my book, How to Monetize Despair. It's a self-help themed kind of book. I'm going to be reading 4 poems today, and this first one you'll be able to relate to if you've ever read a self-help book. I read a lot of self-help books, even though they all kind of say the same thing and don't really help, but I keep buying them because I feel like it's productive. This one's called Don't Forget to Take Your Heart Medicine. Everything is possible. I am capable. We can seek help from a God we don't believe exists. I am only bad at things because I believe I am bad at them, etc., etc., etc. Just one time, I'd like to open a self-help book and see a picture of the author at their absolute worst and have them say, I know what you're thinking. What a before picture. But this was from this morning. Or perhaps it could have a photograph of an old, lonely man covered in liver spots looking out a window as a recreational activity, even though there's a brick wall blocking any view, and the place beside the window is the coldest spot in the house, and it is winter in Chicago. And the man is nursing a hemorrhoid. And by nursing, I simply mean he has a donut cushion, not anything crazy. And there's no pictures on the wall, unless you count the note beside the bathroom mirror that says, don't forget to take your heart medicine. And somehow you can tell all of these from the photograph. And the caption simply says, this is your future, even if you try. This next one is about my mother. How to write about trauma. It is so peaceful to be unconscious. The EMT cradled me like a long sleep as he carefully pulled me from the wreckage. My mother was in the front seat. Not unconscious, just dead. A different, permanent type of peacefulness. I'm taking a free course now. How to write about trauma. All the students are women, and I wonder if they're more prone to trauma or if it's because the trauma is often the result of men. I'm not saying it is, I'm just wondering if it is. My mother was driving us home from her fiance's house after a long day, and she fell asleep at the wheel. Everyone always encouraged me to feel guilty. Maybe you could have woken her before you crashed. I don't know because I don't remember. My brain won't let me remember, and that's probably for the best. All I remember is seeing and feeling blackness, like a starless space, and hearing my mother's last words, "What time do you think we'll be home?" I have two more. One more about my mother, and then one that is a little more upbeat. This one's called Balloon. This is me trying to describe the expression I never saw on my mother's face until she was in a coffin. The expression that says, "My mouth is wired shut so it doesn't hang open as you look at me." She laid helpless as they sewed wire through her gums, her skin slack and bunching around their hands. It made a sound like a needle running through an airless balloon. And I'm sorry, but it just doesn't look right the way her mouth is closed. If you try to make her look like she was sleeping, I'll have you know that you just made her look like she was dead. I didn't know about the embalming process when I was 14. I was probably just stupid. I didn't know that at the wake she would be missing all of her organs, that she would be a shell like a Russian nesting doll. I'm just trying to explain how horrible going to your mother's funeral is. I'm not trying to bother you. My grandfather's wife said, "Does that look like your mommy?" with a smile. And I said no, because it didn't, because my mother never looked dead before. She responded just by smiling bigger, and I still don't understand what the fuck that was about. This is my last poem I'll be reading today. It was inspired by a cockroach. I know most people hate cockroaches and think they're disgusting, but I think they're kind of like cute little citizens in our houses, just kind of trying to make it work, just like us. So this one's called "A Philosopher Afraid of the News." Wait for me in the sink. Wait for me in the mirror. Wait for me on the bathroom floor. Good, the cockroach has followed my orders. Now remind me with the weakness of your exoskeleton that we are all expendable. He touches his antenna to the wall. You're right, the wall is weak. It cannot even contain voices of all delicate things. He touches his prickly brown leg to a crack in the tile. Yes, scientists still are unsure what lies beneath Earth's crust, and that gives validity to the idea of hell. His antennas raised sharply. It's true. Haven't you seen the news? I turn on the sun lamp. He runs to hide behind the garbage can, his feet going back and forth along the floor like windshield wipers. Ah, how predictable, a philosopher afraid of the news. I pick up the garbage can. He sits still. Why display your weakness then attempt to resist death? He sits still. Oh, what a display. I smush him with a wad of toilet paper. I flush it all down the toilet. I stare at the lid. God, please protect us from these things. Thank you.
Thank you for reading. Our final reader of the evening is Yvonne Osbourne. And Yvonne has had her poetry and short stories in a number of literary magazines and also in the Literary Lab's anthologies Let Evening Come, which is her debut novel. So we're going to hear from Yvonne this evening.
Whoops. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I'm just going to read like the first chapter from my novel. I can't show you the cover because it's not due out until April 2nd. It's called Let Evening Come. So I'm going to read like from chapter 1. There were some things that Sadie Wixom would never forget. Her mother's apron smeared with chocolate and blood. Riding a motorcycle into the boreal forest with winter coming. And making love in the back of a van with a boy from Saskatchewan. The first time she saw him, it was from the vantage of height. She was throwing hay down for the horses when she heard a truck pull into the driveway. She leaned out the opening in the side of the barn and watched her cousin Sam park his truck by the stable. He threw her a wave, but her eyes fastened on the stranger climbing out of the passenger side. He wore a flattened fedora and a pair of baggy pants cinched at the waist. An object hung against his leg, and for a second she thought it was a gun. He looked up at her from under the brim of his hat and tipped it back with his finger. Their eyes locked for a moment, then he disappeared with Sam into the shadows of the stable, and she stared at the space they had vacated. She climbed down the ladder into the cool of the barn, where the cows were contentedly chewing their cuds, and the pregnant barn cat padded across the stanchions. She combed the hay out of her hair with her fingers and took a shortcut through the side door to the stable that housed her 2 horses. The stranger was running an admiring hand over the withers of her favorite, 2 Socks. "This is Stephen Monaghan," Sam nodded at him. "We're going to ride the horses, and he's going to show me how to throw that thing." He motioned at the wooden object hanging from a braided loop from the stranger's belt. Stephen gave her a nod from under his hat. He had dark hair and a heavy brow. There was a cut in the corner of his mouth, and he had a band-aid over one eye and a bruise under the other. She felt an immediate distaste for him and took offense to his nicked-up face, the hair that hung lank to his shoulders, and the hands on her horse. "He bucks," she said curtly. He studied her with eyes the color of 2 Socks and shifted uneasily under the weight of his regard. "Ask him," she beckoned at Sam to deflect his attention. But he was still staring at her. "What's your name?" His Canadian accent was discernible in 3 syllables. "Sadie," she said, crossing her arms. "You've got some horse, Sadie." And he dragged his eyes back to the horse and stroked his flank. Sadie found herself looking at his hands, brown as 2 Socks' withers. Brown as the leather reins he juggled across the horse's neck like he needed to get accustomed to them. "He doesn't like strangers," she said. "Don't be rude," Sam said. "He bucked you. That was your damn dog's fault." The dog had been with her for 6 months, the first thing her father brought home after the tornado zigzagged across the county, sparing one family to flatten another. He was a shaggy, long-haired dog of no discipline or discernible breed, but he attached himself to Sadie and came when she called. Stephen ran his hands down 2 Socks' neck, and the horse nuzzled his shirt pocket. "I think I can handle him," he said. She pursed her lips. "What's his name?" 2 Socks, because he has 2 white feet, she added as if he needed an explanation. "Tussock," he replied like it was one word. He stroked the barrel chest down to the fetlocks, murmuring his admiration. He was all over that horse, and 2 Socks accepted the familiarity, docile as a kitten, belying Sadie's concern. She looked at him from across the horse's wither, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Okay if I ride your horse, Sadie? I'm just warning you." He held out his hand under 2 Socks' nose and whispered words she couldn't understand. He nickered. The horse nickered and tossed his head, knocking Stephen's hat off with his nose, and she laughed. He plucked it out from under the horse's feet, knocked the dirt off against his leg, and settled it back on his head. "We've come to an understanding," he said with a serious look. Sam chuckled and threw the saddle on the other horse's back, a plucky little mare, and rocked it into place. A companion for 2 Socks, her father had said when the horse trailer pulled into the yard a month earlier. First she got the dog, and then a companion for 2 Socks. While others tiptoed around her, her father kept bringing things home, and everything dovetailed into before and after. She lifted the saddle off the sawhorse and balanced it on her knee, but he dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "I don't need that." "Steph rides bareback," Sam said smugly, as though he was privy to all of his secrets. She cradled the saddle against his stomach and stared at the 2 of them. "How do you plan to mount him?" she said. Stephen didn't seem to hear her. He immersed in the secret dimension of man and horse, each with clear understanding of the other. He ran his fingers under the noseband of the bridle and spoke to him in soft undertones, then grabbed a handful of mane and in a blur of movement swung himself up, put the horse forward, touching the brim of his hat with his forefinger as he rode out of the bay. She stared after him in disbelief. "Who'd you say he was?" she asked Sam. He stared as Stephen put the horse into a canter around the circle drive. "I'd say he can flat out ride a horse." "I didn't ask your opinion of that." "Well, you know the family that moved into Dad's rental. I'm supposed to show this one around." "Where are they from?" she asked. "Saskatchewan. Be nice. He wanted to ride. Can't you just be nice?" "He's rude." Sam rolled his eyes. "Ignoring your stupid comments doesn't make him rude. He's cheeky and rude." Cheeky, why are you so judgy? What happened to his face? Was he in a fight? Found one on his first trip to town. With who? Won't say. What's that thing in his belt? Sam laughed. It's called a boomerang, cuz. She watched the stranger with his odd attachment bring the horse down from a trot to a walk, leaning over his neck and talking in his ear. I thought that was an Aussie thing. Nah. I told you, Saskatchewan. He's Dene, or Dunsaline. Something like that, he said with a shrug. I've never heard of them. Ancient indigenous tribes, he grinned. They have secret powers. Sadie rolled her eyes. Other than the dark hair, he didn't look like pictures she'd seen at school of indigenous people. A little too tall and a little too thin, like he wouldn't survive a winter. You could say they're homeless, so we have to be nice. I know it'll be hard for you, Sam said. Maybe you can hook up, though, being new and all. He won't be aware of your personality. She flung the grooming brush at his head. He ducked. Watch it, he growled. You need to start acting like a lady if you ever expect to get a guy. He mounted the mare, giving her a disapproving once-over. You know, if you wore something other than those grubby jeans and actually brushed your hair once in a while, maybe you could get one. I swear to God, you're turning into a slob. Ever since, he clapped his mouth shut. Ever since what, Sam? But he rode out in pursuit of the one he was supposed to be showing around. She gave the empty pail, the water pail, a satisfying kick, then looked down the lane to where the horses were galloping into the distance. She ran her hands over the worn trappings of the tack, remembering the way his hands acquainted themselves with her horse, the way his gaze unsettled her. There was an aura of apprehension about him, as if he was readying himself to meet any hint of trouble. Do I have any more time?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
You have about 3 more minutes.
Okay. Now she left her boots on the back porch and washed her hands in the sink. She took down the jar of peanut butter and rummaged through the refrigerator for jam. The homemade jam was all gone. They were down to store-bought grape. Homemade jam was in the before category. She grabbed a plate and a jug of milk, put it on the table, and sat down with her grandpa. He had his plat map, draft paper, and pencils on the table. What are you doing, Grandpa? She asked. He peered at her. Just cogitating, Sadie. Where's Dad? Out with the pickup. She nodded. Ever since her mother was killed by a nail-studded board flying through the air with the velocity of a 200-mile-an-hour wind, her dad had taken to driving around, but never having been anywhere when asked. What are you drawing? She said. He tapped the pencil on the table. House plans. House plans. Can't stay here forever. Your dad will meet someone. Meet someone? She snorted. What's that mean, meet someone? The man needs a woman. What's this, the 18th century? It's the way it is. You didn't after Grandma died. I was 70 years old. Besides, I had your mother looking out for me. A clock ticked away from the bowels of the house, and she could hear herself chewing. He has me, she said. He took his glasses off to better see her. He doesn't want you looking out for him, Sadie. Well, if you move out, so do I. The thought of living alone with the quiet man who looked through her without seeing her was unsettling. What would they say to each other? Her grandfather was the foil against which they balanced themselves on the tightrope walk through the after. You're his daughter, Sadie. You'll get on. Well, you better have 2 bedrooms in that plan. She took another bite of her sandwich and chewed and swallowed. What about the other one that was just out here? Do you know anything about him? He leaned back in his chair and tended his fingertips. Well, they lost their land through a court ruling. The father was jailed for illegal occupation and a murder charge, drummed up according to Helen. He struck his head. I understand he died while incarcerated. The other boy's been in and out of jail. So a bunch of criminals. Some wouldn't say that. She thought for a minute. You can't just kick people off their land. It's been going on forever, Sadie. Well, I thought Canada got along with their Eskimos and all. They aren't Eskimos. They're an indigenous people, unfortunate enough to be living on oil-soaked sand and catches of uranium. Well, she said, that kid that came out with Sam to ride, what's he in trouble for? He's a long way from home, Sadie. Why don't you try to be nice? She scoffed. Everyone wanted her to be nice. He's already been in a fight. That right? Is that all you're going to say? It's not surprising folks around here are suspicious of outsiders, especially anyone who looks different. You mean anyone who isn't white? He shrugged. Wasn't always like that, but lately, well, throwing an accent and that attitude, it's like a hand grenade with a loose pin. You're saying he's provoked it? I've heard he's a hothead. She slouched in her chair and crossed her arms. He's riding 2 socks. He looked at her with a little furrow on his brow, and Sam didn't even ask. He clucked his tongue, shaking his head mockingly. Didn't even ask. She pushed her chair back. Oh, everyone's belittling her concerns. Well, he should have, she said, and she dropped her dishes in the sink with a clatter. She opened her laptop and Googled the tar sands. She clicked on a video posted by Greenpeace, shot from a helicopter over what was once boreal forest, but now hid the largest of the tar sands developments, open mine pits and tailing ponds. A gust of wind riffled the papers on her desk and billowed the curtains like a ghostly presence. She replayed the video and turned up the sound. The camera panned down on the desolation. She didn't blame them for leaving. Why would anyone want to stay?
Okay, thank you so much for reading, everyone. I think we would like to do a Q&A now, and I would like to start with if each of you could talk about what inspired your books. And Mr. Costa, I was amazed that the 2 characters in yours, they both seem like monsters instead of one seeming like a monster because one did something that we don't know yet. And in all of the pieces, they're all moving. Lisa, I'm not sure you know it, but you could actually name a cockroach in the name of one of your friends, or there's a library that's doing that, a museum that's doing that. So let's talk about what inspired all these magnificent pieces. Who wants to start?
I'll start since I went first, and as I said, the name of the book is Comets. And my dad had a cabinet shop for 60 years, and all of the stories mostly revolve around the people in and out of the shop, but it revolves around their lives. And my premise was, in effect, part of what I saw growing up. But when you're a kid and you see people doing things, you have one perspective, but then if you get into that person's life, there's another. So my book is checkerboarded with a first-person story and a third-person story, and it goes back and forth. And so at one point in the story, the main character, who's Roberto or Robert, he may see somebody in the shop, and he's a young guy. He's 12 years old now, working there, and he sees somebody talking to themselves, and it's a character named Crazy Jimmy. And you think the guy's crazy, but then you find out when you get into Crazy Jimmy's story that he had a child who was abducted and killed, and he never got over that. And that story explores trauma. And so a lot of things happen to people. Everybody in life is going through something. And I take that premise where this character doesn't see those things as they're happening. And you find out he's an unreliable narrator in the book. And so it captures people working, people coming from other countries, getting into the shop, and then it goes into their lives to show you it's not, everybody is layered. Everybody's like an onion, and everybody has complex lives. While as the main character, the through-line protagonist, he doesn't see that. And that's what I try to cover in Comets.
Sounds like an intriguing book. Anyone else? Lara?
I will say it was interesting to me because I wrote a memoir that talked about my father and my mom's back a few years ago, and I thought I had said everything I wanted to say. But then this book is totally about my relationship with my father, and as he got dementia and as he approached death, I realized that I had more to say. And it was, for me, writing is processing. So it was like I knew that I had to process it. And so I was writing and working on it. And then my hope was that someone else out there who has a terrible relationship with their father who is also dying might appreciate, my struggles. So that was my impetus.
Sounds very poignant. And how about you, Mr. DePietro?
Kiss and Release is sort of the joke is sort of that I was kissing a lot of frogs at the time, and I was in a time in my life that was where I was looking for stability and not finding it. And there's a long poem in the book called "Love Is Finished Again," which is from a poem that's originally in Hebrew, and it sort of meditates on one love ending and another beginning, and are we really just always finding ourselves in the same place, or is it a little different every time? And so it gives the book a kind of the book kind of comes at you in a rush, I think, but the poem slows you down to where you can do some reflection about what's really going on. So it was really fun to kind of put together all the poems I had written in that period with that as kind of a framing device. Yeah.
I think many people can relate to that kind of experience too. Kissing a lot of frogs. And Lisa, what inspired your book?
Well, I had been working on a lot of poems for like 3 years. And at the same time, I was compiling this list called Titles of Self-Help Books on Loverwrite. And I don't know why. It was just like an entertaining, fun thing to do. And then at one point, I just decided to kind of combine the two things. So there's the title, How to Monetize Despair, which is also the title of a poem in the book. And then the sections are titled with like how-to titles, like How to Be a Flock of Burning Canaries, How to Remove the Kettle from the Flame Right Before Its Hideous Whistle, How Not to Succumb to Mediocrity. And I guess most of it just comes from my amusement about self-help books, how terrible they are, how fun they are, how much money I waste on them. So yeah, I guess that's kind of how that came to be.
I think that's a pretty ingenious thing, since probably all of us here have bought numerous self-help books as time has gone on. And what about you, Yvonne? The story with the horses sound really wonderful. What inspired that, and how much research did you have to do to write viscerally about horses?
Did quite a bit of research about it. It came from like a single memory. Sometimes I can just write a story based on a single memory. When we were kids, our parents went to Australia and father brought back a boomerang, and we went out in the field, in the pasture, promptly to try to throw it and lost it. And that was just kind of traumatic at the time. But just from that one memory, I just, I built this story in this other world. But I've always had a lot of empathy for indigenous peoples. I think from the time I read Ramona when I was like 13 years old, probably. And so I just have always been interested in that, and the controversies over the energy, the tar sands controversy and all that in Canada. And so it just sort of snowballed into a novel.
No pun intended with Canada and the snow. So why did you choose to set it in Canada and not in Michigan?
It actually begins in Michigan, and probably 2/3 of the novel does take place in Michigan. And then, it's kind of back and forth over the border. But the bulk of it does.
I realize the Michigan and Canada are pretty much neighbors.
So yes, definitely. Yeah, just right over the bridge.
So let's talk about writing process. Like, how do you approach writing? Do you write, and this is for everyone, do you write every day? How do you fit writing in with the rest of your life, with jobs, and if there's, how do you approach the writing process? And I guess this time we'll start with Lisa and then go around, because I know that she's also the editor of the or the assistant editor of Atmosphere, which requires a lot of reading. So how do you approach the writing process?
Well, that changes. Sometimes I rely on inspiration, which doesn't usually work out very well. Sometimes I force myself to write. What works best for me is to read, go through my books, look at my dog-eared pages, and reread things that I enjoyed and things that inspire me. Sometimes I just need to write. I just need to read one line, one really good line, and then I'll be set to write for an hour. And as far as fitting it into my day, I mean, I have a pretty flexible schedule, so whenever I feel like I want to write, then I write. But yeah, I think one mistake I make a lot is just being like, well, I'll write when I'm inspired, because when you do that, it's like you're kind of screwed, because then you'll never end up writing.
Yes, that's true. How about you, Laura?
I try and show up every day to write. I can really spend a lot of time procrastinating and not writing, but I do try and have a goal. I think it was Dinty Moore who said once, you'll never have a great writing day if you don't show up in front of your computer to do it, But I notice I drive a lot, and when I'm driving is when I'm most inspired to write, because I can't. And in those cases, I try and talk into my notes app on my phone so that when I go home, I will actually remember what it was I was thinking about.
That's a really great idea. Mr. Costa, well, how do you manage to get in writing time with a teaching schedule?
I write all day. I'm a write for a living, so I write mostly marketing and advertising, TV commercials, and I produce. But I also write scripts and screenplays, and have sold a few. I'm a binge writer, and when I was writing, I've written a couple of novels before this, and those take just enormous blocks of time. And you almost have to lose part of your life to me to write a novel, because either you're going to lose your friends or your family or something, because you can't just sit down for 20 minutes, or unless you're just going to write a scene. It's especially when you get into the middle of it and you're 200 or 300 pages in, you kind of have to figure out where you are, and then you want to spend 3 or 4 hours writing. When I got into writing the collection, I'm more of a binge writer. This book is more than anything else an homage to my dad, and he's in every story. And I have that inciting sort of story. That thing that happened in my past, and I go, oh, this can be a story. And then I write it, and I binge on that. I might do it 3 or 4 nights in a row, and then I let it sit. Things have to sit for a while for me. I met an agent once, and he said, most of the novels and the stories I turn away is because they're too young, because writers write them and then they send them out. But I find that if something sits for a week or 2 weeks or even longer, you get a different perspective on it, and you go, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have written it that way. So I think I would say I'm a binge writer. I don't do it every day to sit down and do this.
And Mr. DePietro?
I'm very linear in most areas of my life, but finding time to write is the one area where I'm kind of all over the place. So I relate to what Lara said, like inspiration comes sometimes when I'm driving or anytime, and I might have to email myself or use the notes app. And so I generate a lot of little free writes and ideas and notes to myself. So usually the first draft of a poem is more like a note to myself about the poem I want to write. And then when I find the time, which sometimes I need to be at residencies or, really lock myself away, but the magic really happens when I'm shaping it and revising it. And so I also relate to what Mr. Costa said about the perspective that you get when it has sat for a while, and then you're rewriting it and reforming what it was about.
And Yvonne?
Yeah, like I guess it was Mr. Costa said, you basically lose your life when you're writing a novel, and that's true. When I'm into a novel, it's like those characters can be more alive to you than your own family, and that's all you want to do is just stay with them. And that sounds kind of crazy, but it's so true, and it's actually very invigorating when you get into that mindset where you just are in that world, and sometimes I'm not a outliner at all. It just happens, and you don't know what they're going to do, and they surprise you, and you're like, wow. And that's just fun. I write every day. In this particular novel, 6 years. You talk about
Wow.
it can't be a quick thing, and like you say, you go back to it again and again, and after countless passes and editing, it's like finally, and then I'll look back on it and I thought, oh geez, there's a sentence I want to change. I mean, there's no end to editing, but it's fun. That's the main thing. It's fun.
It is very fun, and this reading, I hope everyone who joined us this evening enjoyed the readings. I want to let everyone know who's watching that you can pre-order all these books on Unsolicited Press's website under pre-order. All these books are available, and I hope that everyone will join us again on February 7th for our next Literary Nights with Unsolicited Press. So I want to say goodbye to everyone. Goodbye. And we will see you on February 7th. I hope you'll join us again then. Bye-bye.